love the privilege of introducing our speaker tonight. I have the privilege of introducing my seminary professor. What a treat. Dr. James White, if you don't already know, is the director of Alpha and Omega Ministries. He's a professor of church history and apologetics at Grace Bible Theological Seminary. And he's taught Greek, Hebrew, systematic theology, textual criticism, church history, and various topics in the field of apologetics for numerous other schools. He's authored many books, over 20. We have several here tonight. Some of those are The Forgotten Trinity, the King James Only Controversy, The Potter's Freedom, The God Who Justifies, and one on the Quran. He has engaged in more than 175 moderated public debates. Many, if not all of them, are online for your viewing on Alpha and Omega Ministries' website. He is currently a pastor and elder of Apologia Church in Arizona. He's been married to Kelly for more than 39 years and has 2 children and 5 living grandchildren. Would you please give a warm welcome to Dr. James White.
Now it looks like I've got to update my bio. It's 40 years for Kelly. Once you get there, you don't want to take a year off or lose a grandchild along the way or anything like that. So we switched over because I want to see if we've got lots of tech for you tonight. Not really. I do have some things I want to show you, but we have to make sure that it's going to digital devices, I think, may have demonic influences. They work absolutely fine in practice, rehearsal, and then when you actually have to use them, nothing happens. So there we go, and let me see if this works. And no. So why don't you hit play for me, and let me see if I can blank it out from there. And no, guess not. All right, just go ahead and hit play, and we can look at a blank screen. No one will care too much about that. All right, let me start off. There we go. That's perfectly fine. At least that's not distracting to anybody. I did do a debate recently with a guy who said he wanted to do a digital presentation, and so he had a white screen that he put up. He had a 20-minute opening statement. He didn't use it until 18 minutes in. So can you imagine this huge white square? It was just blinding everybody. Everybody started doing this number for the whole time. Did not work well for him at all. It really didn't. But were y'all praying for Duffy this weekend? Because he had to take my final exam just a couple days ago. So if you see a little bit of a twitch going on, that's it happens to everybody. He'll get over it eventually. So it is good to be with you. I want to show you. I have so many Bibles that it's almost a crime. But I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Jeffrey Rice, but Jeffrey Rice has post tenebris lux Bible rebinding, and he'll tell you that he did a rebind of a Nestle-Aland 28th edition Greek New Testament for me. And when I showed it on the dividing line, that started his business. It really did. And so he does beautiful, beautiful work. And he was going to sell this thing, and I don't know if I should admit this, but I contacted him privately, and before it became available to the public, and I said, think maybe I could have a shot at that before everybody else does. And he sent it to where I was speaking in St. Louis. I normally don't use the ESV. The ESV is a fine translation, but this is the ESV Creeds and Confessions Bible, so it has in the back things like the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, the Chalcedonian Definition, the Augsburg Confession, Westminster, London Baptist Confession of Faith. It's got a bunch of stuff in the back, and it actually has a font I can read. That's so wonderful. I used to have these teeny tiny little font things, and now they're completely worthless. I should just give them away to young people who can still read them. But ESV, how many people have an ESV here? Is that the Pulpit Bible? Is that your standard translation? Okay. How many have a New American Standard, NASB? Ooh, yes. How many of you have heard of, or maybe already have, the Legacy Standard Bible, which is basically, okay, number of people, which is basically the 95 NASB with all the changes that I always made when I preached from the NASB. Literally. So I am actually using that. When I use an English translation, that one's a really good one to use. The reason I got this one is my Legacy Standard Bible, Jeffrey bound it for me. It has goat skin. It is so soft that at night you can hear the ghosts going, bah. It's really awesome. But the problem is it's so soft it doesn't travel well. You know, bumps and scrapes and stuff. You know. So this thing is good old Texas cowhide. So that's why it's one of the main reasons that I got it. How about an NIV? Okay. Everybody's smiling when they do it. How about a New King James Version? All right. And how about the good old KJV? Anybody admit to having a Schofield? Hey, all right. I got them all. Okay. Well, okay. You got the one you got with you now. That's the main one. I still have an Oxford. The first time I read through the Bible systematically as a teenager, I got to tell you why I did it. I've told the story before, but everybody remember Jack Chick? The Jack Chick tracks, the comic tracks, like This Was Your Life and Holy Joe. Boy, most people are going, nope, never heard of it. Yeah. Jack Chick, back when I was a kid, I got sent to the principal's office in 4th grade for passing out Jack Chick tracts on the playground. Okay? And so the only thing I could think to do, because I had never been sent to the principal before, the only thing I could think to do was I walked up to him in his office and gave him one too. So, but I read a Jack Chick tract, and basically it was a story of a person who dies, goes to heaven. He had a lot of those stories, and you run into Habakkuk walking the streets of gold, and Habakkuk comes up to you and says, "So, what'd you think of my book?" And I hadn't read Habakkuk yet. So I read it that night. I had no idea what it was about, because I didn't want to run into Habakkuk. I didn't want to die that night, run into Habakkuk in heaven. And then I realized, oh no, what about Zephaniah? And Nahum. And so that's why I started reading through the Bible in a year, and I did it, because that way, when I get to heaven, I can at least say, I did read it. I don't remember a word that I read, but I did actually read that whole thing. And I read a New Schofield Reference Bible from Oxford. And to this day, I still have that Bible. I think I have every Bible I've ever purchased, actually. The cover on that thing is still some of the most awesome leather that was ever created by God. It was absolutely wonderful. So here we have all these different Bibles. And yet, there are some differences. Does anybody here actually have in your possession, physically, a King James or a New King James Bible? You're actually carrying it. One person. Okay, good. And everybody else has an ESV. So who would be my experimental person with you have an ESV in your hand? Who would like to volunteer to read me something? Come on now. Okay, right here. All right, so I would like you to read to me, and you too, sir, look up, please, Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 4. Everybody look it up, in your Bible as well. Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 4. So we'll have our ESV guy go first, and then our King James or New King James, either one will work, in the back. So, Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 4.
Can't help it.
What's wrong? You won't read it for me?
Not either.
You mean, well, it can't go from verse 3 to verse 5.
Yes, sir, it does.
Yeah, it does. So what does John 5:4 read in the King James or New King James?
Verse 4,
Yes.
for an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the spring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had.
That's not a short little phrase. That's an entire verse. Now, obviously, if your eyes are better than mine, you look down at the bottom of your page, in the ESV, and it's down there. It's in the footnotes, in that tiny little font that no one can read. But there is an entire verse difference. So when we talk about the reliability of Scripture, we need to be fully aware of the fact that we are reading an English translation of a text that for the New Testament was written almost 2,000 years ago, and for portions of the Old Testament almost 3,400 years ago. That's a very, very, very long period of time. And so the English language did not exist at that time. It came into existence, depending on how you define it, over the past 1,000 years or so. And in our current form, only a matter of hundreds of years ago. And so you have issues of translation, and then you have issues of transmission. We don't have just one manuscript of the Old Testament in the language in which it was written, which is the language of Hebrew, but even the Hebrew language developed from the days of Moses to the days of David to the days of Malachi. And then there are about 12 chapters in there, especially in Daniel, that are in a different language called Aramaic. It's very much related to Hebrew, but it's a different dialect, basically. And most of you have heard of, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered last century. And they, up until their discovery, the oldest manuscripts we had of the Old Testament in Hebrew were from about 900 years after the birth of Christ. So there was a 900-year gap between when the originals were written and the first copies that we had. Now, you had little fragments on pots and pottery and stuff like that, but as far as full manuscripts. Then we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are written about 100 years before the birth of Christ. So we leap back 1,000 years. And you've probably heard the great Isaiah scroll that was found at Qumran. And if you look at the Isaiah scroll and you look at what we had in what's called the Masoretic text from about 900 years after Christ, there was no difference. I mean, it was transmitted for 1,000 years without change. And we've all heard that story, but please be careful, by the way. Because the book of Jeremiah, the text that we have in Jeremiah between the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint and the Hebrew, one is 1/3 shorter than the other. So there can be differences. Now, there's a reason for that, by the way. If you're a close student of Jeremiah, you know that he wrote more than one version of his book. The king tore up one of his scrolls, so there were multiple versions that were in circulation. So it's understandable why there would be a major change like that. But be really careful, because I watched somebody, I debated one of the leading critics of the New Testament in English-speaking world by the name of Bart Ehrman back in 2009. And during the Q&A section, a kind believer got up and threw the Isaiah scroll at Bart, and I just knew it was going to happen, and he came back with Jeremiah. So, as I expected that he would. So, just be aware of the fact that, for example, what was the Bible of the early church? Well, what do you mean, what was the Bible? It wasn't just the same as ours? Well, remember, when you're reading Acts, none of the New Testament exists at the point in time where Peter is preaching at Pentecost, or even Paul later on is reasoning with Festus, or whatever situation we'll go back. There is no New Testament at that time. And the New Testament is written over a much shorter period of time than the Old Testament. The Old Testament's written over a period of 1,000 years by many, many different people, many of whom we don't know who they were. We don't know who they were. There's no name on 2 Chronicles, okay? And may have been written by multiple people because they're books of history, okay? So 1,000 years, and the New Testament's written only in about, it could be as little as 30 years. Some people would say as much as 50 years or 60 years. It depends on where you start it and where you end it. But it's a much shorter period of time. And it's written in a language, the Old Testament's written in a language that only the people of Israel basically know. It's not meant to be distributed around the world. But thanks to Alexander the Great, who was not all that, he was a conqueror, but he also enslaved millions and millions of people. So you sort of have to define the word great. The Greek language was spread all over the world. The Romans just sort of adopted all of that. And so in the days of Jesus and the apostles, you did have people who spoke Latin and all the languages of the peoples that Rome had conquered. But there was one language that everybody had familiarity with, even Galilean fishermen. And it was what's called Common or Koine Greek, which is what the New Testament is written. And so, how did that... Think about the process. Think about... I had lunch with some of your leadership today, and I understand you're in the book of Romans, right? All right, where did Romans come from? If you're going to be starting chapter 9? Good luck with that. As you know, I've done a few things with Romans chapter 9 over the years. Do not be concerned if you see people getting up and walking out the back. It happens every time. It's just what Romans 9 does to people. It's really weird. Anyway, how did you get that? How did that end up in your Bible down there? It wasn't written in English. It wasn't printed in nice font with gold edges on the pages. Where did it come from? Well, Paul dictated it. He dictated it. It says in Romans, it names the guy he dictated it to. So he dictated that letter, and it was written probably on a something called papyrus. It may have been a scroll. You know what's really interesting? Christians didn't like scrolls. We've only found about half a dozen to a dozen maximum scrolls of the Christian scriptures. Christians wanted a codex form. That's what this is. This is a codex, printed on both sides of the page, bound like this, like a book. That was not the popular form of literature in the first century at all. We're not exactly sure why. But Christians didn't. Was it so they wanted to be differentiated from the synagogue that used scrolls? I don't know. We just don't know. So we don't know exactly what form Romans was written in, whether it was a codex or a scroll. But it was written probably on papyrus, and then it was given to someone who stuck it in a leather bag, and that someone had never encountered deodorant. Right? And they either walked or rode a stinky animal along dusty roads or very stony roads. Rome had some great roads. It is funny to go to Italy today and see roads that the Romans made 2,000 years ago, and they're still in great shape. We can't do nothing. One winter, and it's not sure that we've really actually improved things a whole lot over the years. But anyway, and it eventually gets to Rome, and on a Sunday morning, someone got up and read that epistle to the church at Rome. That was a long sermon. It was a little bit like my fellow elder, Jeff Durbin. He recently did a 94-minute sermon. I think it would take you more than 94 minutes to read Romans, but it was probably a long time. And then copies were made of it and distributed to other churches, because in Rome, all roads lead to Rome, or all roads lead from Rome. And so it would be distributed out to other churches. And there would be multiple copies made. How do you get from that hand copying? Photocopies were invented in 1949. Anyone remember those old mimeograph machines? The smell of those things. It made us all really weird. I remember those from my youth as well. Up until then, it was either printed, after the invention of printing in the West anyways. The Chinese beat us to that by a long shot. But in the West, Gutenberg's press. But up until that, it was handwritten. And if I took a few paragraphs in my own handwriting, and my handwriting isn't bad. My printing isn't bad anyways. My cursive died long ago. But if I took something and gave it to the people in the front row, and I had you copy it and give it to the people in the next row, and then you copy it and give it to the people in the next row, all the way back to the back, Would they all read the same in the back? Nope. People would be distracted. People have different levels of eyesight. People have different levels of interest. And there would be variation. And then if 300 years from now, all we had this person's and that person's and that person's and that person's manuscript, how would you reproduce the original? That's what New Testament textual criticism is about. Because remember something. Starting with Nero in AD 64, until all the way through the most intense period of persecution, there was 10 years where the Roman Empire, all across the Roman Empire, tried to wipe out the Christian faith. And those years were?
I knew that was coming.
You could tell that was coming. Isn't that mean of me? I mean, I'm the professor of church history. He just took my early church history class, just took the final, and that was one of the questions on the final. Now you can find out whether you got it right or wrong, huh?
Please do tell us.
Please do tell us. Are you sure you've taken it? That would be a pretty cool way of doing it, you know. If I get a note from you that says, "Oh, I forgot to submit this," I'm sorry, it ain't going to work now. Between 303 and 313, the Roman Empire tried to wipe out Christianity. And they destroyed thousands of copies of the Scriptures. Thousands and thousands of copies of the Scriptures. And then the peace of the church comes in 313, and the persecution ends. And by the end of that century, the Roman emperor declares Rome to be a Christian empire. Now that's all fascinating stuff I can't get into, but the point is, we have about 5,800 handwritten manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek. That doesn't mean that they're from Matthew to Revelation. Sometimes the older they are, the much more fragmentary they are. The older they are, the not older, so the newer they are, the more full that they can be. But the job of New Testament textual criticism is to take all of that and recreate the original. So when you look at John 5:4, and you see the ESV doesn't have it, but the King James does, why would that difference exist? Well, just a little more history here. The King James and the New King James are based upon what's called the Textus Receptus. Now, the Textus Receptus is just a Latin phrase that means received text, and no church ever gave it that name. That was an advertising blurb. Back in the 17th century, everyone studied Latin. So you even advertised in Latin. We don't do that anymore, just in case you haven't noticed. And so that was an advertisement for a printed edition of the Greek New Testament, and they called it the Textus Receptus, the received text. And that was based upon primarily the work of a Roman Catholic priest and Dutch humanist scholar by the name of Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus was a fascinating fellow, can't get into him. I really fully expect to see Erasmus in heaven, to be honest with you. But he only had between 6 and 12 manuscripts to work with. We have 5,800 today. And so it's based upon a very small number of manuscripts. And the King James and the New King James are translated from that, whereas your ESV, NASB, LSB, NIV, RSV, NRSV, and the plethora of other English translations, modern English translations, are translated from the modern, what's called the eclectic Greek text, or it's called the UBS, right now the UBS 5th edition, National 28th edition, that comes out of Munster in Germany, where they draw all these manuscripts together and provide a standardized text. So anyone can buy, and now it's all right here. And this is really new. I mean, it's only been the past decade that finally all of this became available electronically. But you can access the reading of almost all of those manuscripts if you want to. Christians are very open about this. Here's our manuscripts. Here's what they say. We don't try to hide anything. And here's where all the variations are. Because there are variations. How many of you have ever noticed those teeny, 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 tiny little notes at the bottom of the page that say some manuscripts say this and some manuscripts say that. Okay, how many of you will look at me and honestly say, yeah, that sort of bugs me a little bit? Isn't there just a little tinge of, eh? Maybe you're asking me to define for you, I'm not sure. But if you're honest, most people say, yeah, I wish they weren't there. Well, first of all, you should be glad they are. The Muslims have their Quran, and there are variants between the manuscripts of the Quran, but the Muslims don't know what they are. There are no critical editions of the Quran. There could be, if they want them, but they don't want them. Some people are working on them, but most of them are not Muslims that are working on them. So it's actually a really good thing that we have that information and that we're open about it. Because people in the ancient world, they didn't even give a second thought to the fact that there would be differences between their manuscripts because everything was handwritten. There was no printing. So that was just, yeah, of course there are. Scribes make errors. That's life. But in our modern day, with the printed text and now, with computers and things like that, we apply a different standard. And we don't like having to deal with the fact that there are later manuscripts that contain this description of an angel coming down and troubling the waters, whereas all of the earliest Greek manuscripts we have of John chapter 5 do not contain that story. And just in passing, large majority of New Testament textual scholars would say that was actually... How many of you take notes in your Bible? I notice you have some wider margins in your Bible there, Pastor. And I guess they make journaling Bibles and stuff like that now. And so, wow, there's lots of stuff out there. Left-handed, green-eyed people's Bibles and stuff like that. So, a little bit of a marketing ploy there, I think. So how many of you do make notes? Because my mom used to do that. My parents are gone now, and so I've gotten like some of my dad's old Bibles and my mom's old Bibles. Her handwriting, wow, that was just incredible. It was so good. But she would make notes. And Christians have always done that. And most scholars believe that John 5:4 is an early marginal note that explained, because think about it, why were all these sick people laying around this one pool? Well, everybody in Jerusalem knew why. But if you didn't live in Jerusalem, how would you know why? And so probably in a sermon at one point, some pastor was saying, now this is why they were there, because an angel would come down and trouble the water. And someone goes, I want to remember that. And then someone copies that person's manuscript. And they're gone. They're dead and gone. So you can't go to them and say, is that an explanatory note? Or it was also very common when you were copying the scriptures that if you skipped a line, if you skipped something and you've gone all the way down, any of you, I wrote most of my high school papers with an IBM Selectric. Oh, that was a typewriter, wasn't it? Only the old people are going, oh, yes, it was. The smell of whiteout, correction tape. These young people don't know what it was like. That's why you should respect us young people. We endured a lot. I had to stop typing once in a while because a dinosaur would be walking across and I didn't want to hear it. You need to respect us. What were we talking about? I don't know. So there would be times I'd be typing a report and I had to remember to put the footnote in. But if you forgot and got too far down the page and there wasn't any place for the footnote, you know what you did? Now, young people, try not to faint here. You took that thing out you had just done typing, and you crumpled it up, and you threw it in the waste can, you got another piece of paper, and you started all over again. That's how you did it. That's why you should respect us, folks. And so they would get to the bottom of the page and then realize, oh. And so they would write what they skipped, because they could get away with this. They didn't have a teacher that was going to mark them off for it, and they'd write it in a smaller font in the margin. So how do you know which one it is? And the neat thing, and by the way, this is a good thing, Christian scribes tended to be extremely conservative. They didn't want to lose anything. And so the assumption was if it was there, it needed to be there, and they'd copy it. That means over time, when you compare the earliest New Testament manuscripts to ones 1,200 years later, the earlier manuscripts are about 1.5–2% shorter than the ones later on, because you would have this natural growth where things are being included. And you might go, I don't like that, but think about it. What's the alternative? I think it was Rob Bowman that used this. It was a really good illustration. He said, what we face with the New Testament is like having a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Anybody ever done a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle? No one in here has ever done a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. I guess that's not big in Texas. Okay. It's like having a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Which would you rather have? Only 9,900 pieces? Or have 10,500 pieces and have to figure out what the extra 500 are? Because if you have 9,900, you're never going to get the complete puzzle. You can't finish it. If you've got 10,500, you've got to do some comparison, but you still got all the originals. You've got all the pieces that are supposed to be there. And that's what we have with the New Testament manuscripts. So you'll hear people say, and it's true, they will say, well, the number of variants in the New Testament, what's a variant? It's John 5:4 is a variant. In John 1:18, the oldest manuscripts of John describe Jesus as monogenes theos, the unique God. The later manuscripts say monogenes huios, unique Son. That's a variant. If manuscripts spell one word with one letter difference, that's a variant. There's in the Greek language, you have something called the movable nu. And we have it in English too. You're supposed to say an apple, not a apple. We put an N in there so that you can pronounce, you don't put two vowels right next to each other because you can't pronounce it. Greek did the exact same thing. It's called the movable nu. We had a guy in my first year Greek class many years ago when I took Greek. Med Skeens was his name. And Med could not figure out the movable nu for his life. He barely passed thanks to the movable nu. There are unbelievable numbers of variants in the New Testament that have to do with the movable nu. Well, guess what? That doesn't change the meaning at all. At all. So you'll hear people, you go to the local, even to the local Bible college, at the university, there are 400,000 variants in the New Testament. And it's probably 500,000. But how many of them are actually relevant to the transmission of the meaning of the text? About 1,500. So you divide that up with the total number of pages of the New Testament, that's a small number. A very small number. And most of those are noted at the bottom of your page. You can see where, And you do need to know the two biggest variants, because people like Bart Ehrman and his students, they love to come along and smack Christians upside the head with the two largest variants in all the New Testament. They are the longer ending of Mark 16, 9 through 20. If you look at Mark chapter 16, you'll see in your Bible, it'll have like brackets or double brackets around it, and it'll say many early manuscripts do not contain this, etc., etc. And verses 9 through 20, 12 verses. Now that's the section about, handling snakes. But handling snakes, drinking poison, Jesus appearing in different forms. It's an interesting section. It really is. And the earliest... Now, the problem is that for almost every book, the beginning and the end of the book would frequently get damaged when it was a freestanding book. And so there's very frequently issues with the endings of books because pages fall off and stuff like that. In fact, let me just tell you a quick story here. When Erasmus was coming up with his Greek New Testament, the first published and printed Greek New Testament, his printer, John Froben, was pushing, get it done, get it done, get it done. This is about 15, 16. 15, 15. Anyways, around that time period. And Erasmus could not find any manuscripts of the book of Revelation from which to take the Greek text. By the way, of all the books in the New Testament, the book that we have the fewest manuscripts of is the book of Revelation. Why? Because it really struggled for inclusion in the canon. there were a lot of people that read the book of Revelation and went, you sure John wrote this? 10-headed beasts and 7 horns and all the rest of this. You sure this came from John, right? And so we have the fewest number of manuscripts from the book of Revelation. So eventually he borrowed a friend's Latin commentary on Revelation that had the Greek text in it, and he had to extract the Greek text from the Latin. He made a number of errors in the process. Partly because Erasmus really didn't think that Revelation should be in the canon anyways. He didn't necessarily believe it was inspired. But then he got to the last chapter. And guess what? The last few pages of the commentary had fallen off. So what did he do? He back-translated from his own Latin translation of the New Testament into Greek. And so in the Textus Receptus and in the King James and New King James Version to this day, there are words and phrases in the last 6 verses of Revelation chapter 22 that are found in no Greek manuscripts anywhere on God's green earth. And they came from Erasmus at the beginning of the 16th century. It's good to know these things, and it's nice to know that today we have all sorts of manuscripts of Revelation, including the 22nd chapter, and can correct what Erasmus did. And you're sitting there going, why didn't Erasmus ever fix that? Because he did numerous more editions of the Greek New Testament in his life. The last one just shortly before his death. So why didn't he ever fix it? Partly because he didn't really worry too much about the book of Revelation, A. But you want the real reason? I just love church history. The real reason is, when he did his second edition, he said to his printer, he said, I've got a lot of problems in Revelation. The Align brothers have put out an edition of the Greek New Testament since I did my first edition. So go buy one of theirs and just use their book of Revelation and just replace mine. There's one problem. That's what the Align brothers did with Erasmus. They had just taken Erasmus's book of Revelation and put it in theirs. And Erasmus didn't know that. So it never got fixed for hundreds of years. Now, you may be sitting there going, how can that be? Well, think about it. It was not more than 50 years ago that the leading scholars in the world would actually be able to get some kind of idea of where most of the New Testament manuscripts were and what they had in them. And it's only been over the past few decades that we can literally sit at our computers and gather together from libraries around the world these manuscripts and what they contain and read. That is a blessing. That is a blessing. It's not, when a lot of people first hear about this, they're like, well, I'm not sure I like it like that. That is a blessing. The very time when we have the biggest onslaught against the New Testament is when we have the most information about its transmission we've ever had, available to more people than ever before. Remember using a card catalog at the library? Okay? They don't even exist anymore in the vast majority of places, right? It's all electronic now. And there was no way for anyone to know what manuscripts were in what college, what university, what museum, anything like that, until just recently. Now when we put together a Greek New Testament, down at the bottom of the page, you've got all these manuscripts listed because we can now collate all of them and go, this manuscript reads this and this manuscript reads that. And in fact, at Munster, what they've done and what they're doing right now, actively, is they're producing a massive edition of the Greek New Testament called the ECM, the Editio Critica Maior. And they're using something that I'm not going to explain to you right now because we're going along anyways, called CBGM, Coherence-Based Genealogical Methodology. And what they've done is they've collated more manuscripts. Collated, that means taken all their readings and compared them to everybody else's readings. We now have a database of all the manuscripts and the readings they have that has never existed before. When we say that the New Testament manuscripts agree in certain percentage up until literally the past 10 years. That was always just a guess based upon a scholar someplace. Now you can get a computer readout of it. You can go online and bring it up on your own screen for any variant in the New Testament. Now, it's not all done, but for right now, Mark, John's going to be coming out soon, Acts, and the general epistles, they are all done. And for any variant there, you can go online for free right now and dig so deep you'll get lost. Believe me. That's a good thing. That is a positive thing. It's not a negative thing at all. And so, back to where we started with all this, the reason you have differences between the King James and New King James, they're using the Textus Receptus, modern translations are using the modern Greek text, which are influenced by all of this study. And you have textual variants. But the other reasons are because of differing translational philosophies. And so you have a difference between a very formal or strict translation and a more dynamic, paraphrastic translation. And every translation is a mixture of them. You can find places where even the King James translators gave a really paraphrase translation of something. Normally they didn't do that. The New American Standard is normally very formal and strict. The NIV much less so, but there are times when the NIV has a super literal reading and the NASB has a less literal reading, and the ESV sort of bounces around between the two. And so it's a matter of translational methodology, not necessarily a difference between the manuscripts themselves that are being translated, that will explain the differences that you have. Now, before I show you, because it's one thing to sit here and talk about manuscripts, but I like to show people the manuscripts, so that those little notes down at the bottom of the page all of a sudden take on some reality. But before we look at them, why is this important? Let me tell you a story from my own experience that will give you an idea of why this is so important. I was teaching apologetics at Phoenix Seminary back in 2016, and I got a phone call one day, and it was from Satan. CNN. Same thing. And a representative of the Dr. Drew Show. Anybody know the Dr. Drew Show? You heard about that? Okay. They wanted me to come on to talk about transgenderism. Well, that's a setup. And the first time I was on via Skype. Bad move. Bad move. You can't have a debate on Skype. You can't do it. Not when they're all live and you're hearing what they're saying 3 seconds after they say it, and they're talking over you. And so I wasn't overly satisfied with my first appearance on it, and I thought, well, okay, I tried to get some truth out. I did the best I could. A couple days later, they called back. They want me back on. I'm not sure if I just made a really good doormat or just what it was. And I said, well, I'll be honest with you. I'd much rather be in studio. Well, we don't have any money to fly you out. I said, well, my wife works for the airlines. I can fly out myself. Well, we can't put you up. We'll get a hotel. We can't get a car. We'll do that ourselves. Okay, if you can get to the CNN headquarters in Los Angeles, we'll have you on in the studio. So I walked into the gates of hell and fought through the demons and got to the green room, where the producer informed us. I love this. The producer informed us that we need to keep our answers very short because their studies showed that if any one person, you're going to love this, if any one person talks for more than 15 seconds, their audience will tune out. That's where you get the real deep coverage of the news when you do that. So I just realized I have gone way... No. I'm doing okay.
You're good.
I'm good? I'm good. Okay. All right. Good. We've got it set up here for enough time. All right. So during my appearance... Now, I was on with the guy... Did any of you remember the former Army chopper pilot, about 6'2", who now thinks he's a girl? And he was on with Ben Shapiro. And Ben Shapiro misgendered him. And he takes this hand, which was far larger than Ben Shapiro's, I can assure you, and puts it on Ben Shapiro's shoulder, and in a deep masculine voice says, if you do that again, they will take you out of here on a stretcher. Very, very feminine thing to do. That's, all women I know threaten to do that. So I was on with him. Yay! It was an experience. All of that to say, at one point during all of this conversation, I made reference to Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus says, from the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said, and then he defines the family. And one of Dr. Drew's sidekicks said, well, you know, that's just one religious text, that's just one religious perspective. And my response to him was, the man I'm quoting predicted his own death and resurrection, and then was crucified, buried, and rose again the third day, and ascended into heaven. He's coming to judge the living and the dead. When you can do that, we'll listen to your opinion. He didn't really have much of a response to that, actually. Now here's the problem. Did you hear what I said? I said the man I'm quoting. And in light of, I've mentioned his name a few times, Bart Ehrman. You can see the debate I did with him in 2009. He will not debate me anymore. It's funny. When we do debates, we always give an unedited master to the other side, so both sides can distribute the debate as they feel free. For years, he never posted that debate. And then finally he did. And the comment he made when he posted it was, this was not my best debate. Now, for Bart Ehrman, that's as close as you're going to get to an admission that he did not win that debate that you'll ever get. We stood toe-to-toe. And I got him to say things. I got him to admit that that we have far earlier attestation for the New Testament than for any other work of antiquity. And this is the leading critic of the New Testament in the English-speaking world. I didn't even expect that. So he has students everywhere. My poor daughter, her first semester at a local community college ran into this vile anti-Christian bigot. That's the only way to describe it. I mean, I bought her an MP3 recorder so she could record. I did not know you could use that kind of language in a public school, but you can. They don't care. And she, after weeks of patience, I mean, she's attended, I have this wonderful clip that I play. I was debating a Muslim on Long Island, and the camera pans back, and there's just nothing but this long line of Muslims waiting to ask me questions. The Christians didn't get up to ask questions like, Christians, what are you doing? Come on. Yeah, we won the debate, but still get up and ask questions, because now I've got to deal with this. And the camera, when it would show me, once it widened out, and here's this little 9-year-old girl sitting on the front pew, looking back at all these Muslims asking questions of her daddy. And so, I don't know if any of you are familiar with my daughter Summer. She has a webcast called Sheologians that is really, really popular. A lot of people love listening to it. The apple didn't fall very far from the tree on that one, and I'm very proud of that. But she patiently endured this guy's attacks on Christianity until finally she just, as you would expect, popped. He was saying some stupid thing about the languages of the New Testament, and she challenged him because she knew the languages in which the Bible was written. My dad's a professor of those languages. I've heard him debate this stuff. And he just went nuts at her. And his final, deepest scholarly refutation of her was, just Google it. There you go. He is the kind of student that Bart Ehrman produces that is teaching in every local community college across America and English-speaking world. And so, because of that, there is tremendous skepticism about the text of the New Testament. So when I said on the Dr. Drew Show, the man that I'm quoting, I know I can back up the textual validity of Matthew chapter 19. But what happens when you quote it? That's why we have to have an idea of where the Bible came from. and what the standard attacks against the reliability of the text of the New Testament are. Ehrman is a radical skeptic. He once said, now I've been told that he backed off on this, but I've never seen it. But he once said in a debate with Dan Wallace that unless he had, how did he put it, 10 notarized copies of the Gospel of Mark dated within 6 months of the original, he could never really know what Mark actually wrote. That is the level of skepticism that no one has ever held in the past. If you have that level of skepticism, you don't know what happened in ancient history any earlier than about 1800. You have no earthly idea. You certainly don't know anything that happened in the Roman Empire, anything like that. Because you simply don't have that kind of information about antiquity. You just don't. And so it would be the end of all history, all understanding of everything that came before us. And it's very modernistic. I mean, we have people, now that we have these things, anything that happens, if there's a police incident anywhere, what do you see? You see 20 people doing this number, right? These things didn't exist. I remember the first digital camera I got not that long ago, 640 by 480 resolution. Wow, that was great. We just don't realize how things have changed so radically in the modern period, and we apply modern standards to antiquity, which they would look at us and go, what in the world are you talking about? And so there is a tremendous amount of skepticism. It's a radical level of skepticism. And it's not that we don't have the information, but let's just be honest. There's a bunch of things about the history of the Bible we don't talk about enough in church. We let our students go off and get hit with this stuff at the university. Rather than, we kept the students interested with pizza parties at church, but we didn't tell them about where they got the Bible from. And then they go to the university and they lose their faith, and we wonder why. The reality is, there's work to be done. And it's not just for our students. I saw the young man with the shirt on that says, was it homeschooling what? Homeschooling is, he left too, so I drive him right out of the room most of the time. He's going to come back, and everybody's going to be looking at him, he's going to be going, what did I do? But my grandkids are homeschooled. And that means, now they're going to get the whole story because of Grandpa, and Mom, for that matter, and Dad, come to think of it. But we have to be the ones to communicate these truths to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation after that. And I don't know how long we're going to have the freedom to do that without great suffering. I've taught in Germany many, many times. And Christian parents in Germany have not had the freedom to homeschool for decades. Decades. You cannot homeschool in Germany. It's not. They will put you in jail and give your kids to somebody else. The state will educate your children. So they have to basically they come back from the state school, now you've got to do a whole lot of education on the side too. So you think anybody like in the United States might want to do the same thing? Yeah, you better believe it. You better believe it. So we're the ones that need to know these things. And that has to be our conviction that we can then communicate to the next generations. And it can't just be, the B-I-B-L-E. Yes, that's the book for me. I love that little song. But there's more to it than that. And if the Lord has given us all of this evidence and information, think there might be a reason for it? There is. And we need to be the ones that have that confidence because we know what the facts are. So with that, I'd like to show folks some of the manuscripts. And so hopefully, it's been sitting there for all that time. There we go. All right. Here is what maybe most would say, and there are arguments about this, but most would say you're looking at the earliest scrap of the New Testament P52 from around AD 125. Now, how do you date a manuscript? You walk up to them and say, "Hey, honey, how would you like to go?" No, never mind. Just waking you up. They don't have, a computer printout has that annoying, date, but that doesn't work that way. How do you date a manuscript? It's literally, where did you find it? What was it amongst? And what is the writing style? Because in the Roman Empire, the Roman emperors would come in and they would bring their own scribes with them that would have a certain style that would then be copied across the empire. And so we have, thanks to the English stealing everything from Egypt when they were in control down there and taking it to London, we have lots and lots and lots and lots of papyri manuscripts. And many of those do have dates on them because they're not religious, they are bills of sale. They're legal documents and stuff like that. And so it'll say in the third year of such and such a person or something like that. And so we can figure out what the date is. And then by comparing handwriting styles, we generally get a 50-year window. 25 years each direction. So when this says AD 25, what that's saying is somewhere between 100 and 150. That's extremely early. You need to understand, for the vast majority of works written in the first century, contemporaneous with the New Testament, the average time period between when the book was written, like Pliny, Suetonius, some of the Greek historians, the average time period between when it was written and our first copies is between 500 and 900 years. Okay? So all those works that you see being cited in history, Suetonius, Pliny, all these people, the first copies we have of their works are between 500 and 900 years after they were written. This is written around 125. Well, what's it of? Well, by the way, it's about the size of a credit card. As you can tell, this was the top of the page because you can see sort of the margin at the top. So it's written on both sides. Again, Christians used the codex, and so they wrote on both sides of the papyrus. That was very unusual. And what's fascinating is, if you went to seminary in the 1880s, you would have been told, especially on the basis of the authority of German scholarship, that the Gospel of John was written about 170. And you go, 170? John was really old. No, they didn't believe John wrote it. And the idea was the Gospel of John has such a high view of Christ that it had to have evolved over time. You have to have enough time for that to take place. So John probably wasn't written until about 170, 180 AD. They denied that he was an apostle, etc., etc. That was very, very, very common. What I love about P52 is it is from John chapter 18, verses 31 to 34 on one side and 37 to 38 on the back, which happens to be Jesus' discussion with Pilate about truth. What is truth? And so I think it's sort of really cool that probably our earliest scrap of the New Testament is from the Gospel of John, which relegated a vast majority of German scholarship to the trash can once this information became available, because it was said that the four leading papyrologists at the time, 3 dated it to around 125 and 1 dated it to the first century. And so now you might go, yeah, but there's not much to it. That's right. But what it does is it tells us that John chapter 18 existed as John chapter 18 at that early period of time. It wasn't evolving. It wasn't, anything like that. It doesn't give us much in the way of textual variants and things like that, but it gives us testimony to the antiquity of that book. It's not something that was written long, long, long afterwards. And again, in comparison to any other work of antiquity, we have, as Bart Ehrman admitted in our debate, far earlier attestation than any other work of antiquity. So you run into a professor who quotes from Suetonius but questions the New Testament, the guy's a hypocrite. If he's going to question the reality of the New Testament, he needs to be questioning all of history. And there are a few of them out there as well. But that's P52. Then we have, it's a whole lot easier to see this one right behind my head, huh? This is P72, and I saw this. Now I'm looking at this. got to what, 7:40? Is that what we're doing? 7:40, okay. I saw this very page in 1993. I debated Jerry Matitix on the subject of papacy during the papal visit for World Youth Day. We did 2 debates over 2 nights, 7.5 hours of debate on the papacy. And since the Pope came to town, they had the Papal Treasures exhibit. And when I read a newspaper and saw that a page of P72 is going to be there, I said to Rich, I said, we're going. Yes, Rich and I have been around that long. It's amazing. And so it was one of the first things. You walked in, it's under glass. And it's very readable. It really is. This says Petru Epistolae Be, 2 Peter. So if it's an alpha, it would be 1 Peter. It's 2 Peter. So this is the end of 1 Peter. This is the beginning of 2 Peter. And you'll notice something up here. You'll see these words that have a line written above them, right here. And there's one here, there's one here. Those are called the nomina sacra. The nomina sacra, the sacred names. We do not know why. We do not know why. But Christians abbreviated the sacred names like Lord, Christ, God, Father, Spirit. They would abbreviate them and write them with this line up above. Lots of theories about why, but we don't know. We just don't. But it makes it really, really, really easy for you to identify a Christian manuscript. Because as soon as you see, here's another one here over at the end of 1 Peter. As soon as you see a nomina sacra, this is a Christian scribe. This is a Christian manuscript we're dealing with here. And it's very, very readable. So I come walking in, and I'm just like, oh. So I'm looking at the nomina sacra. And I don't think I have it in here. And I hope I can go backwards. Yeah, okay. So I did point out Petru Epistolae Be. I thought I'd written it someplace. Yeah, here we go. Come on, you can do it. There you go. I made it bigger so you can see Petru Epistolae Be. I start translating it. And so people would come up, and I'm just absorbed in it. I mean, they have crowns and tiaras and diamonds. I could care less. This is the only reason I came. So I'm looking at this thing, and what's neat is right up here, you have what's called a Granville Sharp construction. So at the beginning of 2 Peter, our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, where God and Savior are both being used of one person, Jesus Christ. So it's very relevant to the deity of Christ. If you deal with Jehovah's Witnesses, Unitarians, people like that, it's very important. So here it is in a manuscript, which, if you remember the Da Vinci Code, anybody remember the Da Vinci Code? Man, for years, every place I flew, people sitting at the airports were reading the Da Vinci Code. Then the movie came out and all the rest of this stuff. And the whole idea about the Da Vinci Code was that the deity of Christ was made up by Constantine at the Council of Nicaea in 325. And before that, everybody believed Jesus was a regular man who was married, had kids, and all the rest of this kind of fun stuff. And so here is a manuscript that is long before Constantine was a gleam in his daddy's eye. And it's teaching the deity of Christ. So much for the theory behind the Da Vinci Code. So I'm looking at all this stuff, and people would come up, and they'd look at it, and they'd look at the description, and they'd look at me, and then they'd see Rich stand there, and they'd go, "Can he read that?" And Rich would go, "Yeah." "Look at this, Harold. This man's reading this ancient manuscript." And people start gathering around, and then the security people are doing this number and stuff. So Rich would drag me off to go look at a crown or a tiara for a while, and then I'm right back again until they finally said we had to move along. But it's just incredibly clear, and yet those lines aren't exactly straight, are they? This wasn't really a professional scribe. And the thought crossed my mind even as I was reading it. Here's a believer from 1,800 years ago. And ask yourself a question. How big would your Bible be if you had to hand copy it? Because here's someone who's taken time. They don't have LASIK. They don't have fluorescent lights. It may have been, well, it was illegal to copy these things all during that time period in Rome. They may not have been persecuting for that at that particular time, but was this guy risking his life? Was this maybe a literate person traveling? They visit another Christian church, and someone brings out 1st, 2nd Peter and goes, we've never heard that. We don't have that in our church. Can I make a copy? Yeah. And that's what we have 1,800 years later? Don't know. But one thing was obvious is here's somebody who loved the Word of God a long, long time ago. And it was special to see that, to actually see that manuscript sitting there. They have a facsimile of it in the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C. that I showed people we did a G3 tour. The Bible Museum wouldn't let me actually do a tour. So we played Where's White, like Where's Waldo? And we just let me loose in the manuscript section and then told everybody, he's in the manuscript section. And we've got pictures of 150 people following me around in the museum as I'm talking about all the different manuscripts. They let us do it, but I'm not sure we're ever welcome back. I'm not sure. But so this is the earliest manuscript, by the way, that we have of 1st, 2nd Peter and Jude. 1st, 2nd Peter and Jude from around 200. So there's that. I've sort of got to get it up here. There we go. This is P75. This is the end of Luke, the beginning of John. And this is one of the most accurate gospel copies we have. Now, it doesn't have all of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It only has parts of Luke and John. It used to have all of it, but whenever anybody complains about what these papyri look like and how it's broken up and stuff like that, I just look at them and go, what are you going to look like in 1,800 years? They've done pretty good. You're not going to look that good. What's fascinating about this manuscript is we can tell by analyzing the variants in a manuscript how the scribe worked. How would you work? So if you were copying something, would you copy it word by word? Would you do phrase by phrase? It vary from person to person. We know how the author of P75 did it because of the kinds of errors he made. He copied it one letter at a time. He didn't do words. He did one letter at a time. And the result is, it's incredibly accurate. And what's really, really neat is a little bit later on, I'm going to show you Codex Vaticanus. We know Codex Vaticanus is about 325 to 350, somewhere around there, age range. This is about 175 to 200. We know they're related. This is not a copy of this, but this and this are copies of a earlier ancestor. That means whenever P75 and Vaticanus agree in a reading, you're seeing a reading that goes all the way back probably to earlier than 150 and probably to 125. That's, again, astonishingly early. Astonishingly early. When my Muslim friends say that the scriptures have been edited and changed, I'm like, when? Because the time frame, the window, given the early attestation we have, is extremely small. It had to have happened only in the very earliest period of time, when Christianity was still growing, and in many places wasn't even known. Why would there be this concerted effort to try to change things? So P75 and Vaticanus together, very important witness to the text. Well, for P75, Luke and John. This should be, yes, P66. I like this one because you can see what the book looked like. Instead of just a page, you can see, and notice where the damage is. Same place where we have damages to our books today, right? If you have a book and you put it on a shelf, it's that bottom right, it's about that bottom corner that's going to get damaged, and the upper corner, and the spine, of course, is stronger because you've got, the material, papyri here, is held together more firmly at that particular point in time. This is also the beginning of John. In fact, you can read it. It says, NRK, in the beginning of the word, where's was God? wondering, again, nope, okay, all right. Please come back. All the way to P75. I knew it was going to happen. I did not know, some of these I have an animation where I have the final phrase of John 1:1, Kai theos ein ha logos, and the Word was God. I have that get big and come out so you can see it a little bit easier, but evidently this particular one that I chose, I didn't use that animation. That's what I was looking for. P66 is as early as P75, but the author was a little more concerned about how pretty his manuscript was than how accurate it was. But still, it's extremely important, and at John 1:18, one of the most important variants in the New Testament, P66, P75, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus all identify Jesus as the monogenes theos, the unique God. Those are the four earliest manuscripts we have of the Gospel of John. And so when you have that kind of... Now remember, I'll tell you about Constantine von Tischendorf here in a few minutes, but to have this kind of early attestation, people who study other works of antiquity look at New Testament scholars and go, what are you people complaining about? We would love to have a tenth of what you've got. But having all this information... this is P45. I date P45 around 220. I had started a doctoral program in South Africa. My doctorvater, my mentor, had a major heart attack during COVID and had to retire. So I don't know if I'll ever get to finish this project, but I really, really find this manuscript fascinating. This is from the Gospel of John. P45 is the only manuscript we have that has portions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. Everybody that has parts of Matthew, Mark, Luke do not have Acts. It's the only one that doesn't. And it's a fascinating manuscript with some interesting... It seems like the scribe was concerned about improving some grammatical points in passing, and figuring out which ones are which is interesting. This is actually the largest page. Most other pages are much, much smaller than this. Much more damaged, but this is from the Gospel of John. And then we have P46. I saw P46, the actual P46, at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, Ireland. And I saw this page, in fact. This is the beginning of Philippians. This is the earliest manuscript we have of Paul's major epistles. It doesn't have the minor epistles, but it does have the major epistles. And this is where I need your help. I need you to work with me here, okay? And I hope that you can, because I've been hurt many, many times when I've tried this in other places, and I'm sure that you all are so nice here in Texas, you would never hurt me, because this is what we do. There's a certain book in the New Testament that doesn't have authorship attributed to it, called Hebrews. Now, a lot of people think that Paul wrote Hebrews. Now, I'll just tell you in passing, I think Paul preached Hebrews in Hebrew, and Luke wrote it in Greek. Because it's not Paul's language at all, but it is Paul's theology. Its language and its format and its syntax and style is Luke. No question about it. So I think it's Paul's preaching to a Hebrew congregation that he then had Luke translate and render in Greek. That's what I think Hebrews is. Anyway, there's lots of different theories. But here's the question. Is Hebrews in P46? Because that would mean someone around AD 200 thought that Hebrews was one of Paul's epistles. Okay? So what I do is I ask all of my audiences to vote. So I'm going to ask you, do you think P46 contains Hebrews? Yes? No. And here's what happens. Despite my sincere pleas, and sometimes I can even make my lower lip quiver when I say it. A bunch of people are going to sit there and go, I'm not voting. You can't make me vote. There's probably a camera on me right now. You could put it on Facebook, aren't you? I'm not going to vote. And you just sit there, and you don't join in. And it hurts. It really does hurt. So, Now I have all the women voting. And the guys are going, I'm just going to not do it just for the fun of it. Yeah, I know how this works. So, ready? How many of you think P46 contains Hebrews? No, okay. How many of you think it does not contain Hebrews? Man, that's about 60-40. How many of you did not vote? Yeah. Thanks, brother. Appreciate that. The oil dripping down the beard, the unity of the body. Thank you muchly. Anyway, it does contain Hebrews right after Romans. So all that tells you is someone in the year 200 thought that Hebrews was written by Paul. It doesn't prove it one way or the other, but it is... I don't have time to tell you the funny story about what happened in the Chester Beatty Library, but I'll just simply tell you that the security guards were concerned about what I was doing, because they weren't used to having people that would actually translate the manuscripts. Most people just look at the manuscripts, but people trying to translate them sort of freak them out just a little bit. Okay, so, oh, yes, thank you. So I do have graphics here. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay, just the facts. Okay, after the peace of the church in 313, you could have manuscripts produced by and that takes us to, thank you, Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus. Eusebius tells us in his ecclesiastical history that Constantine gave money to the church to copy Bibles because Rome had been destroying Bibles for so long. The Roman Empire then gave money to the church to copy Bibles. This may have been one of the results of that, or maybe a little bit after that. It's somewhere between 325 and 350. This is what it looked like when I saw it in the British Museum in 2005. Looked pretty much exactly like that. I walked in, there it's sitting there. Codex Alexandrinus was right next to it. There was a Tyndale Bible, a 1611 King James behind me, and I was the only person in the room. Which made me go, wow, one well-placed bomb, and all these treasures disappeared. But to give you an idea of what that actually looks like, there is Codex Sinaiticus. Remember, folks, that's handwritten. That is handwritten. It is amazing in its beauty, but there's a marginal insertion right there. Probably skipped something. There's a marginal one right there. There's one right there. There's one between lines right there. And most of those were done originally. So in other words, now Codex Sinaiticus is not just the complete New Testament. It's the complete Old Testament. When it was discovered, it was the oldest Bible known. And it is huge. It's massive. It's massive volume. Its story is long. You could I don't include it as one of my formal debates, but I did a debate with a guy as to whether this is a forgery. You can find that on YouTube as well. But real quickly, this was discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai by Constantine von Tischendorf. Now, if you want to have someone to look up to and go, that guy's really cool, Constantine von Tischendorf was really cool. You know how cool he was? You know who Constantine von Tischendorf... Most people feel that Constantine von Tischendorf was the actual historical character that was the basis for Indiana Jones. He was a believer. Even though he was German, he was rather conservative. And he just believed that there were earlier manuscripts out there that just hadn't been found yet. And when he went to St. Catherine's, when you go to St. Catherine's, there's no door. You have to be lifted up in a basket. And the first time he visited, he found some scraps that they were taking to the kitchen to burn as fuel. And he realized they were extremely ancient, and he freaked out. Don't burn stuff like this! And that sort of freaked the monks out. You know, they don't have a lot of visitors, so they're easily startled. And so they didn't show him anything else. He visited a number of times over the years. It was many years later, on the last day that he was going to be staying at St. Catherine's, he had a copy of the Greek Septuagint published, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Bible of the early church. And he gave it to the steward who had been taking care of him while he was there. The steward opens it up. He's looking at it. I have one of these. Would you like to see it? And he goes into his cell, and he takes out of the closet a large volume wrapped in a red cloth. And he lays it down and pulls the red cloth back. And von Tischendorf is staring at Codex Sinaiticus. But he's wiser now. And so he's like, oh, yeah, well, that's pretty cool. You mind if I sort of thumb through this, take a look at it, this evening in my room? Oh, sure, go ahead. Okay, now we don't have any video evidence of this. 'Cause this is in the 1800s. But I have a really sincere belief that von Tischendorf goes into his room, he closes the door, he walks over and goes, silently, yes! All my years of searching. He spent the whole night, never slept, just looking through this thing and reading it and going, oh my goodness, look at that reading. Oh, what? He's blown away. Tries to purchase it, can't. The Tsar of Russia got involved. The monks at Sinai to this day believe they got ripped off. But it ended up in Russia and then was sold to the British because the Russians needed money really badly in the 1930s, and it's now completely online. You can zoom in super tight. You can have different kinds of light to see stuff. It's all at codexsinaiticus.org, I think, though they really need to update their website. But it is all available to you. And it is an incredible, incredible find. And again, pushed our knowledge of all of the Bible hundreds of years back from where it had been up until that time. Now, very similar to it is Codex Vaticanus, which is in the Vatican Library. It too contains almost all the Bible. Okay, I'll go ahead and tell you the story anyways. Years and years ago, after I wrote the King James Only Controversy, Bethany House Publishers, I can tell the story now, asked me if I would help edit Walter Martin's book, The Kingdom of the Cults. Now, I was like, wait a minute. I was told that the Martin family would not allow any editing of what Martin had written, so what do you mean? He says, well, we've decided to update it. And so we'd like you to do the chapters on Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses. I was like, okay. When I got into the chapter on Jehovah's Witnesses, for some reason at one point, Martin had said that in Revelation 1:1, where Jesus is called the Alpha and the Omega, that this is found as early as Codex Vaticanus. Now, I had just written the King James Only Controversy. It's the only reason that I would know this. And the vast majority of people would not know this, but I'm weird. But Codex Vaticanus ends at Hebrews 9:14. There is text after 9:14, but it's a 10th century manuscript. It's not the original Vaticanus. And so you can't say what Codex Vaticanus reads at Revelation 1:1 because we don't have Codex Vaticanus at Revelation 1:1. So I fixed it. Now, you know what the funny thing is? Everything I fixed. There were a couple of things in Mormonism and stuff. There were some things that needed some fixing. Hey, Martin did an incredible job. He didn't have nearly the resources that we have today on a lot of these things. Only a few years after that edition came out, the Martin family took control of the book again and reverted it back to everything that Martin had. So if you buy the Kingdom of Cults today, it will tell you that Revelation something is in Codex Vaticanus. The original error has been reinserted back into the book. That's how publishing works. One of the fascinating things about this is that somebody, somewhere around 12, 13, 1400, went back through and retraced every letter of this manuscript. I don't know what that poor monk did to get in trouble. That does diminish it a little bit, because now now sometimes you have to go, oop, he didn't get that one right, and you have to examine it very closely and stuff like that. But it is extremely important. This is the manuscript that has, with P75, that earlier ancestor. So when this manuscript and P75 agree in Luke and John, you're looking at a reading from earlier than 150, probably earlier than 125. So it's pretty fascinating, pretty important. This is Codex Alexandrinus. I saw this in the British Museum as well. And in fact, I made a tie out of it. Not the original, of course. They would have looked very dimly upon that. But I took a shot of because it's really pretty. It's a nice color. And I have the section from the Gospel of John where the Parakletos, the Paraclete, Jesus talks about the Holy Spirit as the Comforter. And I made that for my Muslim friends, because my Muslim friends believe that the person being referred to in John 14 and 16 is Muhammad. And that it's not Parakletos, it is the exalted one, the Greek translation, the exalted one, referring to Muhammad. So I can just pick up